My husband mocked me with papers for the house I paid for, but he missed one detail. The deed was in a premarital trust. I signed his trap, walked away, and watched his victory turn into an 8-year prison sentence. Before continuing, write where you are from or what time it is. The heavy silence of the house I paid for felt like a trap as my husband shoved a stack of papers toward me, his eyes cold and full of a greed I hadn't seen until tonight. "Sign or get out," he said, his voice a jagged edge that sliced through 4 years of what I thought was a partnership. I looked at the man I had married, really looked at him, and realized the person I loved was just a mask for a man who wanted a shortcut to a life he never earned. I didn't scream or beg because I knew something he didn't. Something my grandmother taught me about protecting what you build with your own sweat. I picked up the pen, the plastic cold against my palm, and signed my name on every single line with a hand that didn't shake once. I placed the keys on the mahogany table with a sharp click that echoed in the hallway and walked out into the cool night air without looking back. The next morning, the sun hadn't even cleared the horizon when the first cracks in his plan began to show. I was sitting in a hotel room downtown, watching the city wake up, while Blake was likely still asleep in my custom ergonomic chair. He had spent months playing the part of the supportive husband, while secretly meeting with a lawyer he found on a bus bench advertisement. He thought he was a genius for catching me in a vulnerable moment, thinking my business success had made me soft or distracted. Blake didn't realize that a woman who builds a 7-figure consulting firm from nothing doesn't leave her flank exposed to a man who still asks for an allowance. The shift happened at 7 in the morning when his elite lawyer, Thomas Garrett, finally looked at the actual deeds and trust documents. I could almost hear the scream through the phone lines when Garrett realized his client hadn't just secured a mansion, he had walked into a legal minefield. Garrett had a reputation for being a shark, but even sharks know when they are swimming in blood that belongs to them. He called Blake, waking him from his victory sleep, and the conversation was anything but celebratory. "Do you have any idea what you just let her do?" Garrett roared, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and professional terror. "We need to talk about the house right now because you might have just signed your own eviction notice." I spent the rest of the morning with my CFO, Marcus Chen, and my own attorney, Rachel Thornton. We weren't just reacting. We were executing a plan that had been in motion for months. Went to the gym, or met his friends for went to the gym, or met his friends for a liquid lunch. We were documenting the trail of money he was siphoning from our joint account. He thought he was being clever by hiding $37,000 in cash deposits, but in the world of high-stakes consulting, that kind of amateur move is a beacon. By noon, Blake was starting to feel the walls close in, though he didn't know why yet. He tried to use the corporate card to buy a celebratory lunch for his gym buddies at Velocity Sports Bar, and the look on his face when the waiter returned with a declined receipt must have been worth every penny of the retainer I paid Rachel. He tried another card, then another, only to find that every single line of credit linked to my business or our joint life had been severed. He was sitting in a multi-million-dollar home with no way to pay for a sandwich, and the panic was finally starting to override his ego. He called me 10 times in an hour, but I let every call go to voicemail, listening to his voice transform from demanding to desperate with every message. I arrived at Rachel's office for a final review of the documentation, feeling a strange mix of grief and power. She showed me the latest Instagram posts from a woman named Jessica Reeves, a personal trainer Blake had been seeing behind my back. There she was, wearing my diamond tennis bracelet in a gym selfie, claiming she was living her best life. Blake had told me that bracelet was at the jeweler for a broken clasp, but instead, it was being used as a trophy for his mistress. Rachel pointed to the screen with a grim smile, noting that Blake had even given her my grandmother's pearl necklace. It was the ultimate betrayal, taking pieces of my family history to buy the affection of someone who only liked him for the money I earned. The afternoon sun hit the glass table in the conference room as we went over the final numbers. Over 4 years, Blake had contributed exactly $0 to our household while spending over $300,000 of my money on his failed ventures and lifestyle. He called it networking and business development. But the forensic audit showed it was just a series of expensive hobbies and ego trips. He had been a dependent in a designer suit, a parasite who thought he was the host. Rachel leaned back, her expression sharp and satisfied, and told me that by forcing me to sign those papers under duress, he had handed us the evidence we needed to trigger the fraud clauses in our prenuptial agreement. I walked to the window and looked out at the street, thinking about the garden I had planted and the home I had built. Blake thought he could take it because he lived there, but a house is just wood and stone without the person who provides the foundation. He was about to find out that the law doesn't care about his rehearsed speeches or his practiced posture when the deeds are held in a premarital trust. He had gambled everything on the idea that I wouldn't fight back, and he was about to lose the only thing he actually valued, his access to my bank account. The final move of the day was the most satisfying, because it came from Blake himself. He posted a photo of himself in my living room, raising a beer with his friends, and using a hashtag about his new house and new rules. He was broadcasting his intent to commercially exploit a property he didn't own, providing the final piece of evidence for the criminal fraud charges Rachel was preparing. He was so busy celebrating his fake victory that he didn't notice the tow truck pulling into the driveway to repossess the BMW I had stopped paying for an hour ago. I checked my phone one last time before heading to the hotel suite for the night. A message from my neighbor Jennifer confirmed the car was gone, and Blake was standing in the driveway in his pajamas, looking like a ghost. He was trying to call someone, likely his lawyer or his mistress, but his phone service had been cut off as part of the corporate account restructuring. He was alone in a dark house he couldn't afford to light, holding a stack of papers that were worth less than the ink he used to sign them. The second morning of my new life started with the sound of a chime on my laptop, signaling a high-priority email from Rachel. She had spent the night coordinating with the local sheriff's office and a private security firm. While Blake was likely shivering in the dark living room, trying to figure out why the smart home system had locked him out of the thermostat, we were finalizing the eviction timeline. The law in our state is very clear about premarital assets held in a trust, and since Blake had attempted to claim ownership through fraudulent means, he had forfeited his right to the standard 90-day notice. He had 72 hours, and the clock had started the moment he shouted at me to get out. I met Emma, my assistant, at a small cafe near the park to go over the office transition. She looked tired but determined, having spent the previous evening blocking Blake's access to our server. She told me that he had tried to log in 34 times between midnight and 3 in the morning, desperate to find some kind of leverage or financial data he could use. He even tried to email my top clients, pretending to be a partner in the firm, but Marcus had already set up a redirect that flagged his messages as spam. Blake was trying to burn the bridge while he was still standing on it, not realizing the fire was only going to consume him. The middle of the day brought a surprising phone call from Blake's brother, Daniel. Unlike Blake, Daniel was a hard-working guy who had always been a bit embarrassed by his brother's entitlement. He sounded exhausted and told me that Blake had called him from a neighbor's phone, begging for money and a place to stay. Daniel had told him no, citing the 3 years Blake had spent living in his basement without paying a cent of rent before we got married. It seemed the well of family sympathy had finally run dry, and Blake was discovering that the people he ignored during his rise were not interested in helping him during his fall. Rachel called me back into the office at 2 in the afternoon to show me the latest development from Thomas Garrett. Blake's attorney was now trying to pivot suggesting that we settle out of court to avoid a public scandal. He was offering to walk away if I gave Blake $500,000 and the Vermont cabin. Rachel laughed as she read the letter, her eyes flashing with the cold brilliance of a woman who knows she has the winning hand. "We are not giving him a single penny," she said, "and we are certainly not giving him the cabin where your father's ashes were scattered. We are going to offer him exactly what he deserves, a chance to leave with his personal clothes before the sheriff arrives." I spent the afternoon at the hotel, working on a contract renewal for the Morrison Group. It was strange how much more productive I was without the constant background noise of Blake's video games or his loud fake business calls. I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't known in years, a realization that I had been carrying his weight for so long, I had forgotten what it felt like to walk unburdened. Every time I thought about the $342,000 he had wasted, I felt a fresh surge of anger, but it was a cold, useful anger that fueled my resolve. By 5 p.m, the social fallout was beginning to escalate. Blake's mistress, Jessica, had deleted all her photos with him and posted a cryptic message about being lied to by a man who claimed to be a mogul. It seemed she had found out about the repossessed car and the declined credit cards and had no interest in being the queen of a bankrupt kingdom. She was already looking for her next target, leaving Blake to deal with the consequences of his betrayal alone. It was a brutal kind of justice, seeing him discarded by the person he chose over his wife for the exact same reason he chose her: vanity and greed. I received a text from my neighbor, Mrs. Chin, who told me that a moving truck had arrived at the house. It wasn't the professional service I usually hired, but a beat-up U-Haul driven by Daniel. It seemed Blake had finally accepted that the locks weren't going to magically open, and that he needed to save what little dignity he had left. Mrs. Chin described him carrying out his gaming chair and his boxes of expensive sneakers, looking small and defeated under the watchful eye of the security guards I had stationed at the perimeter. He was leaving the mansion not as a victor, but as a tenant who had been found out. The evening brought a final confrontation, though it wasn't the one I expected. Blake managed to get a ride to the hotel and cornered me in the lobby as I was returning from dinner. He looked terrible, his charcoal suit wrinkled and his hair unstyled, the mask of the successful entrepreneur completely shattered. Had mocked me and waved those papers in my face. I looked at him and saw the man who had mocked me and waved those papers in my face just 48 hours earlier. "You did this to yourself, Blake," I said quietly. "You had a partner, a home, and a future, but you traded it all for a chance to steal from me. Now you have exactly what you brought into this marriage, nothing." He tried to reach for my arm, but the hotel security stepped in immediately, having been briefed on the situation. I watched as they escorted him to the door, his protests growing louder and more incoherent. He was shouting about rights and years of service, as if marriage was a job he could get severance for after being fired for embezzlement. I stood in the marble lobby and watched him disappear into the night, feeling a final cord of connection snap. The man I loved didn't exist, and the man standing there was just a stranger with a bad lawyer. I went up to my suite and opened a bottle of wine, the silence of the room a luxury I was finally starting to appreciate. I looked at the legal documents spread across the desk, the maps of my property, and the bank statements that were now safe from his reach. Tomorrow, the locksmith would finish the job, and the cleaning crew would erase the last of his scent from my home. I was reclaiming my space, my business, and my life, one signature at a time. The battle wasn't over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. And for the first time in a long time, I slept without dreaming of betrayal. The third day felt like the beginning of a long, cold winter for Blake, but for me, it was the first day of spring. I arrived at my house at 8 in the morning with a team of professionals. The U-Haul was gone, and the driveway was empty, save for a few scattered pieces of packing tape and a discarded energy drink can. I felt a pang of sadness looking at the home I had worked so hard for, now temporarily a crime scene of a broken marriage. But that feeling was quickly replaced by a sense of purpose when Robert from Secure Home Systems met me at the door. We spent 3 hours replacing every single electronic lock and reprogramming the entire mesh network. Blake's biometrics were purged from the system, and his custom codes were deleted, leaving him as much a stranger to the house as a passerby on the street. While the locksmith worked, I walked through the rooms with Patricia and her deep cleaning crew. The house smelled of Blake's expensive cologne and the stale scent of the cheap Chinese food he had ordered for his short-lived victory party. We found his gym clothes stuffed under the bed and a hidden stash of brochures for luxury condos he had planned to buy with my money. It was a physical map of his deception, and I watched with satisfaction as the crew bagged it all up for disposal or delivery to his brother's house. I told Patricia to pay special attention to the master bedroom, wanting every trace of his presence scrubbed until the air felt clean again. By noon, I was back in the office, and the atmosphere was electric. Now that the news of our separation had broken in professional circles, I was receiving calls from colleagues and clients who had always suspected Blake was a fraud. One of my oldest clients, Mr. Patterson, told me that Blake had approached him months ago, trying to secure a private loan by using my business assets as collateral. He had been stopped only because Mr. Patterson knew me better than to think I would ever authorize such a move. It was a chilling realization that Blake had been trying to bankrupt my company while I was busy expanding it, a silent predator in my own boardroom. Rachel joined me for lunch in the office, bringing a folder full of new evidence that the forensic accountant had uncovered. It turned out Blake hadn't just been siphoning money for his mistress. He had been funneling funds into a sham consulting firm he had registered in a neighboring state. He was using my proprietary client list to try and poach small contracts, offering discounted rates that he couldn't possibly fulfill. He was effectively stealing from the hand that fed him, trying to build a rival empire with stolen bricks. Rachel's eyes were hard as she explained that this move elevated the case from a simple divorce to corporate espionage and felony theft. The afternoon was a blur of phone calls and legal filings. We filed a formal motion for an emergency injunction to freeze the secret accounts Blake had established, and by 4 o'clock, we had a judge's signature. This meant that the $37,000 he thought he had saved was now as untouchable to him as my main accounts. He was truly down to the cash in his pocket, which Marcus estimated was less than $100. The reality of his situation was finally hitting the public sphere, as several of his gym buddies started posting comments on his Instagram, asking why their memberships had been canceled and why he wasn't answering his phone. At 5, I received a frantic call from Thomas Garrett. The bus bench lawyer was no longer sounding aggressive. He sounded like a man who was worried about his own bar license. He told me that Blake was refusing to leave the hotel lobby and was demanding that Garrett do something to get him back into the house. I told Garrett that any further communication should go through Rachel, and that if Blake set foot on my property again, he would be arrested for trespassing. Garrett sighed, a long, defeated sound, and admitted that he was strongly considering withdrawing from the case. Even a lawyer like him had limits, and a client who commits documentary fraud is a liability no one wants. I spent the early evening in my newly reclaimed garden, sitting on the bench near the roses I had moved from my grandmother's house. The air was cool, and the sound of the fountain was a soothing rhythm after the chaos of the day. My neighbor, Mrs. Chin, walked over with a tray of dumplings, her face full of a quiet, grandmotherly concern. She told me that she had seen Blake's mistress, Jessica, drive by the house earlier that day, but she hadn't stopped when she saw the security guards. It seemed the scavengers were already moving on, leaving the remains of the marriage for the vultures. As the sun went down, I walked through the house, opening all the curtains that Blake had kept closed. I wanted the moonlight to flood the rooms, to chase away the shadows of the last 4 years. I found a box of my father's old books in the basement, hidden behind some of Blake's fitness equipment. He had told me they were lost during a move, but instead, he had just pushed them out of sight because they didn't fit his aesthetic. I carried them upstairs, one by one, and placed them back on the shelves in my office, feeling like I was bringing my family back into the home they had helped me build. The night ended with the final piece of news from Marcus. He had tracked a series of overseas transactions that Blake had attempted to make just an hour ago, using a backup credit card we hadn't found yet. The transactions were blocked, but they revealed that Blake was trying to buy a plane ticket to a country without an extradition treaty. He wasn't just planning a divorce anymore. He was planning to run. I forwarded the information to Rachel and the authorities, realizing that the man I married was capable of even more than I had imagined. He wasn't just a cheat, he was a fugitive in the making. I sat in my office chair, the one Blake had tried to claim, and looked at the framed first dollar I had earned. It was a reminder of where I started and how far I had come. Blake thought he could take the fruit of my labor without understanding the roots that grew it. He was about to find out that the law has a long memory and a very heavy hand for those who try to steal a life they didn't earn. I closed my laptop and felt a sense of peace, knowing that tomorrow would bring more challenges, but I was no longer fighting a ghost. I was fighting a man whose time had run out. The fourth day broke with the cold rain that matched the mood of the legal storm gathering over Blake's head. I was at the office by 7, meeting with the private investigator Rachel had hired to track down the remaining assets Blake had tried to hide. The investigator, a soft-spoken man named Miller, had spent the night digging through Blake's digital footprint and had found something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just one mistress. Blake had been maintaining a secondary life for nearly 2 years, complete with a rented apartment in the city and a lifestyle funded entirely by my business's travel budget. He had been a master of the long con, using my trust as a weapon against me every single day. Miller showed me the receipts for the apartment, which Blake had leased under the name of a shell company he claimed was an IT consultancy. The rent was $4,000 a month, paid for with a corporate card that was supposed to be for client entertainment. He had even used the company's health insurance to cover his mistress's dental work, a level of audacity that left me speechless. I had been working 14-hour days to build a legacy, and he had been using that legacy to build a playpen for his infidelities. Every lunch meeting he claimed to have was actually a date, and every networking retreat was a getaway with another woman. By 10 in the morning, the sheriff's department had served Blake with a formal notice of criminal investigation for grand larceny and fraud. They found him at a cheap motel near the highway, the only place he could afford with the little cash he had left. According to the deputy, Blake tried to argue that the money was his by right of marriage, but the officer pointed out that marital property doesn't include corporate funds or stolen inheritance. Blake was escorted to the station for questioning, and the photos of him being let out in handcuffs started hitting local news blogs by noon. The man who wanted to look important in meetings he'd never attend was finally the center of attention, but for all the wrong reasons. I spent the afternoon in a grueling session with the forensic accountants and the IRS agents who had been alerted by Blake's attempts to hide cash deposits. We had to prove that I had no knowledge of his activities to protect my business from being caught in the crossfire of his tax evasion. It was a humiliating process, having to admit how much I didn't know about the man sleeping in my bed. But I didn't flinch. I gave them every password, every bank statement, and every contract, showing them the clear line between my legitimate enterprise and Blake's criminal fantasy. By the end of the day, the lead agent shook my hand and told me that my documentation was the most thorough he'd ever seen. While I was dealing with the government, Sarah arrived from Seattle. She didn't say a word when she saw me. She just walked into my office and gave me a hug that lasted a long time. She had been the one to tell me Blake was a leech years ago, and while she didn't say I told you so, the look in her eyes was one of fierce protection. We spent the next few hours going through the house together, deciding what to keep and what to change. We decided to turn the garage gym into a library and the home office into a sanctuary, erasing every trace of the man who had tried to turn my home into a hotel for his lies. At 4 o'clock, Rachel called with a major breakthrough. She had managed to get a statement from Jessica Reeves, the mistress. It seemed Jessica was more than happy to turn on Blake once she realized he was broke and facing jail time. She admitted that Blake had promised her $1 million settlement and had even shown her the papers he forced me to sign as proof that they would soon be rich. She gave Rachel the keys to the secret apartment and a box of jewelry Blake had stolen from my safe over the last 6 months. My grandmother's emerald ring was in that box, and when Rachel told me, I finally let out a sob of relief. It was the one thing I thought was gone forever. The evening was spent at the secret apartment with the police, identifying the items Blake had taken. It was a bizarre and painful experience, seeing my life scattered in a place I didn't know existed. There was the Victorian secretary desk I thought had been lost in storage, and the paintings I had bought to celebrate my first $1 million deal. Blake had been stripping my home of its soul to furnish his betrayal. The police allowed me to take the smaller items, and I loaded them into my car with a grim determination. I was taking back my history, piece by piece, and leaving Blake with nothing but the 4 walls of a prison cell. I returned home to find Jennifer and Mrs. Chin waiting on my porch with a bottle of wine and a lasagna. They had seen the news and wanted to make sure I wasn't alone. We sat on the back deck, watching the rain stop and the stars come out, talking about everything except Blake. It was the first time in years I felt like I belonged in my own neighborhood, a part of a community instead of a woman hiding a failing marriage. The support of these women was a shield against the shame Blake had tried to heap on me, and I realized that while I had lost a husband, I had gained a tribe. Late that night, Sarah and I sat in the kitchen, drinking tea and looking at the old family photos we had recovered. She told me stories about our grandmother and the hard work she had put in to save the money that Blake had tried to steal. It was a reminder that I came from a line of strong women who didn't break under pressure. Blake was just a small, greedy man who had underestimated the strength of the foundation he was trying to crack. He thought he was a player in a high-stakes game, but he was just a thief who got caught in the light. I went to bed in my own room, in the bed that had been stripped and cleaned, and felt a sense of finality. The investigation was moving fast, the assets were being recovered, and the legal walls were closing in on Blake. He had tried to use my name to build his lies, but now his name was synonymous with failure and fraud. I wasn't just a survivor of his betrayal, I was the architect of his downfall, and as I closed my eyes, I knew that the best revenge was simply being the woman he thought he could break. The 5th day was the day of the formal hearing for the emergency restraining order and the preliminary asset freeze. I woke up at 5, the house quiet and still, and spent an hour in the garden with a cup of coffee. The air was crisp, and the first hints of autumn were showing in the leaves of the oak trees. I felt a strange sense of calm, the kind that comes when you know the hardest part of the climb is behind you. I dressed in my best suit, a sharp navy blue that made me feel like the CEO I was, and met Rachel at the courthouse at 8:30. The lobby was buzzing with reporters, drawn by the story of a high society marriage gone wrong. But I walked past them with my head high, not giving them a single glance. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Blake was there, sitting at the defense table with a public defender, as Thomas Garrett had officially withdrawn from the case an hour before. Blake looked like a shell of the man I had known, his skin sallow and his eyes darting around the room in a panic. When our eyes met, he tried to give me a look of wounded pride, but it fell flat against the mountain of evidence Rachel was about to present. He was no longer the charming entrepreneur. He was just a defendant in a cheap suit, waiting for the gavel to fall. Rachel began the proceedings by laying out the timeline of Blake's deception, from the secret accounts to the fraudulent signatures on the separation agreement. She presented the testimony from Jessica Reeves and the forensic audit that showed every stolen dollar and every redirected contract. The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for being no-nonsense, listened with growing visible distaste as the details of Blake's betrayal were read aloud. When Rachel showed the photos of my grandmother's jewelry found in the secret apartment, the judge let out a soft huff of indignation. It was clear that Blake's attempt to frame himself as the victim was failing spectacularly. The public defender tried to argue that Blake was a partner in the marriage and that his actions were the result of a mental breakdown caused by the pressure of being a supportive spouse. He tried to claim that the secret apartment was a workspace for Blake's consulting business and that the jewelry was given to Jessica as a business expense. It was a desperate, flimsy argument that the judge dismissed almost immediately. "You don't pay for your mistress's dental work and call it a business expense," the judge said, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "And you don't use your wife's inheritance to fund a second life while claiming you're the one making sacrifices." The turning point came when the judge asked Blake directly if he understood the nature of the premarital trust he had signed. Blake stood up, his voice shaking, and tried to deliver one of his rehearsed speeches about love and partnership. But he couldn't even get through the first sentence before the judge interrupted him. "I'm not interested in your vision for the marriage, Mr. Wilson," she said. "I'm interested in why you thought you could transfer property you never owned." Blake stammered, his face turning a deep, shameful red, and finally sat down in silence. He had run out of lies, and the truth was a weight he couldn't carry. The judge ruled in our favor on every single motion. The restraining order was made permanent. The asset freeze was extended to include his hidden accounts, and the separation agreement he had forced me to sign was declared null and void due to fraud and duress. Furthermore, she referred the case to the district attorney for immediate prosecution on charges of grand theft, documentary fraud, and corporate espionage. Blake was taken into custody right there in the courtroom, the sound of the handcuffs clicking shut a final, satisfying punctuation to the proceedings. He looked at me one last time, a desperate, pleading look, but I didn't say a word. I just watched as he was led away. Outside the courtroom, the sun was shining, and the air felt incredibly light. Rachel and I were swarmed by the press, but I only had one thing to say. I built my life on hard work and integrity, and no amount of deception can take that away. I walked to my car, feeling a sense of closure that no legal document could ever provide. The man who tried to steal my future was now facing a future behind bars, and the house he tried to take was waiting for me, safe and silent. I spent the afternoon at the office, meeting with my team to celebrate a record-breaking quarter. We had managed to secure 2 new major contracts despite the chaos of the last week, a testament to the strength of the company I had built. Marcus brought in a cake, and we spent an hour laughing and talking about our plans for the next year. I realized that my business wasn't just a source of income, it was a community of people who believed in me, and I owed it to them to keep moving forward. Blake had tried to poison the well, but the water was still pure. In the evening, I returned home and found Sarah and Jennifer in the kitchen, preparing a celebration dinner. The house was full of the smell of roasting chicken and fresh herbs, the sound of laughter echoing in the hallway. We ate on the back deck, the same place where Blake had tried to intimidate me just a few days earlier. But now, the space was filled with love and support, the shadows of the past replaced by the light of the present. I felt a deep, profound sense of gratitude for the women in my life who had stood by me when everything felt like it was falling apart. As we finished dinner, I walked down to the garden one last time before bed. I stood by the roses and looked up at the house, the windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. It was truly mine now, not just because of a piece of paper, but because I had fought for it and won. I thought about the journey of the last few days, the betrayal, the pain, and the ultimate victory. I knew that there would be more battles to come, more legal hurdles to clear, but the foundation was solid. I was Cassidy Blackwood, and I was just getting started. The 6-month mark since the hearing arrived with a quiet intensity that only a woman who has survived a storm can truly appreciate. I woke up at 6 in the morning, the light hitting the spine of my father's books, which were back in their rightful place on the shelves. The air in the house was different now, filtered through the clarity of knowing that every square inch belonged to me, paid for with my grandmother's legacy and my own relentless work. I walked downstairs to find my office, once a staging ground for a man's delusions, now a sanctuary of high-stakes consulting. The custom ergonomic chair was mine again, its settings adjusted to my height, not his ego. I spent the morning reviewing the final audit trail Marcus had prepared, a digital map of the $342,768 Blake had burned through over 4 years. Every line item felt like a puncture wound, but today, they were just data points in a narrative of survival. I noted the charges for executive presence coaching, a $400 monthly fee I had unknowingly funded so a life coach could tell Blake he was a king while he lived like a stowaway. I closed the laptop with a sharp click, the sound of a chapter ending forever. At 10, I met Rachel at a boutique law firm downtown to discuss the final civil suit for restitution. She looked sharp in a charcoal suit that reminded me of the one I'd bought Blake. But on her, the color meant business, not pretense. We sat in a glass-walled conference room, the city of Missouri humming below us. She told me that Blake's public defender was pushing for a plea deal on the criminal fraud charges, offering 5 years of probation in exchange for a full confession. I didn't even hesitate when I told her I wanted the maximum sentence the law allowed. By noon, the social climate had shifted from pity to professional respect. I had an invitation to speak at the same Harrington Charity Gala where Blake had once tried to scout divorce lawyers. This time, I wasn't the wife standing in the shadows. I was the keynote speaker on corporate resilience. I spent my lunch hour drafting the opening lines of the speech, realizing that my greatest case study was my own life. The irony of standing in the very room where he planned his attack was a sensory jolt that made me feel bulletproof. The afternoon brought a delivery from a local gallery, the original paintings I had bought to celebrate my first $1 million deal. Blake had hidden them in that secret apartment, but now they were back, their colors vibrant against the walls I had repainted myself. I spent an hour hanging them, the physical labor a grounding ritual that connected me back to the woman I was 4 years ago. Every nail I hammered into the wall felt like a stake in the heart of his betrayal. At 4, my phone buzzed with a notification from LinkedIn. Blake Wilson had viewed my profile again, this time from a library computer in the county jail. I didn't feel a sting of fear, only a cold, clinical curiosity. He was watching the life he tried to steal flourish without him, a ghost staring through the glass at a feast he could no longer join. I blocked the account with a single tap, the final digital cord severed. The evening was spent with Sarah, who had flown back in for the weekend. We sat on the back deck, the garden I designed blooming under the twilight. She told me that she had run into Blake's brother, Daniel, at the airport, and he had looked like a man who had finally laid a heavy burden down. Daniel had told her that the U-Haul was still half full because Blake didn't even have a place to put the few things he actually owned. It was a small, bitter truth that made the champagne in my hand taste even better. As the stars came out, I walked through the house, checking the new smart locks Robert had installed. They responded only to my biometrics now, a fortress of technology that recognized only its true owner. I stood in the kitchen and looked at my grandmother's Wedgwood china, the delicate blue and white porcelain gleaming in the moonlight. They were no longer props for a performance. They were the tools of my daily life, beautiful and enduring. I went to bed in the master bedroom, which had been sanitized and reclaimed, the scent of lavender replacing the stale remnants of a lie. I felt a deep, resonant peace, the kind that only comes when the truth has finally been hammered into the foundation of your home. I was no longer waiting for the other shoe to drop because I was the one holding the shoes. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in years, the silence of the house felt like a song. The 7th day of the new season began with a notification from First National Bank. The secret account Blake had tried to build with my stolen jewelry and silver had been liquidated by the court, and the funds were being transferred back to the CBW Holdings Trust. It wasn't the full $300,000, but it was enough to start the scholarship program I had been dreaming of, a fund for women starting businesses after leaving domestic hardship. I sat at my desk and authorized the first transfer, the digital signature 1,000,000 times more powerful than the one Blake had forced from me in the dark. By mid-morning, the reality of Blake's new life hit the local news. His former mistress, Jessica Reeves, had given an exclusive interview to a fitness blog, detailing how he had used my money to buy her affection, and then tried to pawn her own car when the credit cards were declined. She described him as a man obsessed with an image he couldn't sustain, a house of cards that collapsed the moment the wind changed. I read the article with a neutral expression, the drama of it all feeling like a movie I'd watched a long time ago. I met Emma for lunch at the club Blake was once so proud to belong to, the same one that had revoked his membership for non-payment. The staff greeted me by name, their eyes full of a quiet, professional sympathy that I didn't need but accepted with a nod. We discussed the expansion of Cassidy Blackwood Consulting into the European market, a move I had put on hold because Blake had convinced me it was too risky. I realized then that he hadn't been protecting our interests. He had been protecting his own access to my time. The afternoon was a masterclass in reclaiming history. I spent 3 hours with a professional archivist, organizing my father's Hemingway collection and the letters my grandmother had written at her Victorian secretary. We found a note tucked into the back of a first edition, written by my father on the day I graduated from business school. It said, "Build something that lasts, Cassidy. The wind will always blow, but the foundation belongs to you." I held the paper to my chest, the ink a bridge back to the man who had taught me the value of $1. At 4 o'clock, Rachel called with a final update on the criminal proceedings. The district attorney had added 3 more counts of identity theft after Miller found evidence that Blake had tried to open credit lines in my mother's name. He was facing a potential 10-year sentence now, and his public defender was begging for a hearing. I told Rachel to tell them that I would attend the sentencing, not to speak, but simply to be the last thing he saw before the doors closed. The evening brought a visit from Mrs. Chin, who had seen the news about the scholarship program. She brought a small, hand-carved box that had belonged to her own mother, a gift for my new venture. We sat in the kitchen, drinking tea from the Wedgwood cups, and talked about the strength it takes to stay quiet when the world is screaming. She told me that the neighborhood felt lighter since Blake had been removed, like a low-grade fever had finally broken. As I walked her to the door, I noticed a yellow bus bench advertisement across the street, the garish colors of Thomas Garrett's firm faded by the sun. It was a reminder of the cheap, flashy world Blake had chosen over the one we had built. I looked at my house, the lights glowing with a warm, steady energy, and felt a sense of pride that was entirely my own. I wasn't just living in a house. I was living in a victory. I spent the final hour of the day in the library, the space that had once been filled with Blake's gym equipment, now silent and full of books. I pulled down a volume of Maya Angelou and read until the words felt like a heartbeat. The man who tried to steal my voice had only succeeded in making it louder. I turned off the light, the click of the switch a final resonant note in a day that had been entirely mine. The 8th month of my independence began with the first frost of the year, the garden I had planted turning into a landscape of silver and white. I woke up at 5, the house warm and secure thanks to the automated systems that now worked perfectly under my sole command. I spent an hour in the kitchen, making a chocolate souffle for a small gathering I was hosting that evening, a celebration of the launch of the Blackwood Foundation. The smell of dark chocolate and vanilla filled the air, a sweetness that hadn't been in this house for a long, long time. By 9, I was in the city for the formal sentencing of Blake Wilson. The courtroom was smaller than the one where the hearing had taken place, more intimate and far more final. I sat in the front row, Sarah on one side and Rachel on the other, a wall of support that felt impenetrable. Blake was led in, wearing a drab orange jumpsuit that made his once practiced posture look slumped and defeated. He didn't look at the cameras this time. He kept his eyes on the floor, a man who had finally realized that his performance had no audience. The judge spent 20 minutes reading through the impact statements, including the one from my mother and the detailed audit from Marcus. She spoke about the calculated nature of the betrayal, the way Blake had systematically stripped a woman's life while sleeping in her bed. When she reached the final sentence, the room was so quiet you could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Blake Wilson was sentenced to 8 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 5. I didn't feel a surge of joy when the gavel hit the wood, only a deep, profound sense of relief. It was the sound of a debt being paid, not in money, but in time. The one thing Blake had stolen from me that I could never get back. I watched as he was led through the side door, the chains on his ankles clinking with a rhythmic finality. He didn't look back, and I didn't need him to. The afternoon was a whirlwind of activity as we officially opened the doors of the foundation. We had our first 3 applicants, women who had built businesses in the face of incredible odds, and I spent 2 hours reading their stories. They were the real entrepreneurs, the ones who knew that success isn't about the suit you wear or the car you drive, but about the work you do when no one is watching. I felt a sense of purpose that made the last 4 years feel like a prerequisite for the rest of my life. At 4 o'clock, Jennifer Martinez stopped by with a bouquet of autumn flowers from her garden. She told me that the U-Haul truck Blake's brother had used had finally been seen in another state, a final sign that the family drama had moved on to a different stage. We talked about the upcoming neighborhood holiday party, and she asked if I would host it this year. I said yes without hesitating, realizing that the house was ready to be a home again. The evening dinner was a small, elegant affair. Rachel, Sarah, Emma and Marcus gathered around the dining room table, the Wedgwood china reflecting the light of a dozen candles. We didn't talk about the sentencing or the stolen money. We talked about the future, about the lives the foundation would change and the places we were going. The laughter was real. The wine was investment grade, and the atmosphere was one of genuine partnership. As the guests left, I walked through the house, turning off the lights one by one. I stood in the library and looked at the shelves, the books standing like sentinels in the dark. I felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with my bank balance and everything to do with my character. I had protected my house, my business, and my soul, and in doing so, I had built something far more valuable than $1 million estate. I went to bed and slept a deep, dreamless sleep, the kind that only comes when you are exactly where you are supposed to be. The battle was won, the enemy was gone, and the house was finally, truly, and eternally mine. The final day of the first year of my new life arrived with a spectacular sunrise, the sky over Missouri painted in shades of gold and amber. I stood on the back deck, a cup of coffee in my hand, and looked out at the garden that had seen me through the worst of the storm. It was a morning of reflection, a time to look back at the woman who had walked out of this house with a broken heart and realize she had been replaced by a woman who had built a fortress from the shards. The house behind me was no longer a cage of secrets. It was a beacon of truth. By 10, I was in the office, but the work felt different now. We weren't just managing contracts. We were building a legacy. The Blackwood Foundation had its first graduate, a young woman who had launched a tech startup after leaving a marriage that looked hauntingly like mine. I mentored her for an hour, sharing the hard-earned lessons of the last year, the importance of separate accounts, the necessity of ironclad trusts, and the absolute power of knowing your own worth. She looked at me with a respect that I finally felt I had earned, not with my business success, but with my survival. I met Rachel for a final lunch at the cafe where we had planned our first counterattack. She handed me the final decree of divorce, a single sheet of paper that dissolved a 4-year mistake with the weight of a gavel. She told me that Blake had been moved to a medium security facility and was spending his days working in the prison laundry, a job that required no vision, no networking, and no expensive pomade. I signed the last document and handed it back, the paper feeling lighter than air. The afternoon was spent in the library, the space I had reclaimed for my father's books and my grandmother's memories. I sat in the reading chair and looked at the framed Harrison Industries contract, the one that had generated more revenue than Blake had earned in his entire life. It was a reminder that while people can try to steal your assets, they can never steal your ability to create them. I felt a deep, resonant pride in the business that bore my name, a name that was now untarnished and strong. At 4 o'clock, I walked through the house with a sense of ceremony. I touched the Victorian secretary, the Wedgwood china, and the original paintings that had all found their way home. I thought about the $342,000 Blake had spent, and I realized that while it was a high price to pay for a lesson, the woman I had become was worth every cent. I had learned that the best revenge isn't a loud confrontation. It's a quiet, successful life. The evening brought a final, unexpected visitor. Daniel Wilson, Blake's brother, stopped by with a small box of things he had found in his basement, items Blake had stolen years ago and forgotten. He didn't stay long, but before he left, he looked at me and said, "I'm sorry it took us so long to see him for what he was, Cassidy. You deserved better." I thanked him and closed the door, realizing that even the family Blake had tried to use as a shield had finally seen the truth. I hosted the neighborhood holiday party that night, the house filled with the people who had watched the drama unfold and stood by me anyway. We gathered in the living room, the space bright and open, and toasted to the new year. Mrs. Chin brought her dumplings, Jennifer brought her famous appetizers, and the conversation was full of plans for the neighborhood and the foundation. The house was full of life, the kind of life that comes from genuine connection and shared history. As the last guest left, I stood in the hallway and looked at the front door. The new deadbolt clicked into place with a sound that felt like the final period at the end of a long, difficult book. I walked through the quiet rooms, the moonlight illuminating a home that was finally and completely mine. I had protected what was always mine, and in doing so, I had found the strength to build something even better. I went to bed and closed my eyes, the silence of the house a comfort, the future a landscape of infinite possibility. The man who tried to take everything had succeeded only in giving me back myself. I was Cassidy Blackwood, and the foundation I stood on was made of stone, work, and the unbreakable truth. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.